larger than life. That's professional wrestling. One of the things you learn from a very, very early start in the professional wrestling industry is that in wrestling you have to turn it up to 11. It doesn't matter if you're playing yourself or if you're playing a 3,000-year-old demon who just happens to know how to perform in a wrestling ring. You need to make yourself the center of attention, and you need to be larger than life itself. And nothing could be more true than that statement for a man that the world knew as Bruiser Brody. That is, at least until one day in Puerto Rico, when the wrestling world lost one of its most captivating stars way too soon. This is the story of the murder of Bruiser Brody. Frank Donald Goodish was born on June 18th, 1946 in Uniontown, Pennsylvania. He was an all-state American football and basketball player in high school in Michigan before moving out to Texas, where he would play football at West Texas A&M University and then West Texas State. Eventually, he would play for various Texas Football League and Continental Football League teams. However, these ventures, they wouldn't hold his attention for very long. After college, Goodish worked as a sports writer and simultaneously was trained in the art form of professional wrestling by legendary wrestler, wrestling promoter, and wrestling mogul Fritz von Erich from the legendary Von Erich family. This would be where Bruiser Brody was born. So for anybody that doesn't know, wrestling around this time wasn't like wrestling today. It wasn't like WWE where they go on tour around all the states and then all the different continents and all that stuff. There was this thing called the territory system, and much of the wrestling promotions from back then would operate sort of within their own areas or zones, and they never really drifted. For instance, Big Time Wrestling in San Francisco wouldn't even dare to run a show in Los Angeles because that's where the World Wrestling Association ran, and vice versa. Because of this, not a lot of wrestlers would actually be exclusively contracted to just one specific company, and that was something that Brody took full advantage of. Brody was all over the map. He was working in Central States Wrestling, Worldwide Wrestling Federation, Windy City Wrestling, Deep South Wrestling, and the American Wrestling Association, just to name a few. But what type of character was Bruiser Brody? Well, for lack of a better term, he was just absolutely crazy. He played this crazed and angry character who would walk from the entranceway down to the ring while swinging a weapon wildly over his head, and it was usually some heavy chains. Now you could just imagine that sight, someone storming to the ring with these chains flying around. And let's be real, like, the entranceways are kind of narrow sometimes, so you could definitely wing one of the crowd members, so you could often see the crowd just being like, no joke, there's actually some infamous footage of Brody storming down to the ring on multiple occasions with the chain being whipped around his head before going into the crowd with the audience just running for the hills. They literally fled from their seats while this guy was just going absolutely mad with a set of chains. It genuinely looked like Brody was trying to hit them, but that was Bruiser Brody. Frank Goodish was not a madman who wanted nothing more than to just maim someone with a heavy chain. He was actually an absolute sweetheart, and he tried desperately to keep his two worlds completely separate. This was due to the respect that Frank had for the wrestling industry. I mean, he didn't want people to know that Bruiser Brody wasn't a mad character, because then the mystique and the facade, they're just gone, and there's no incentive to get emotionally invested in that character anymore.
Be in the ring with Carlos Colon! Carlos Colon! Let me tell you something about Bruiser Brody. He's a whole lot like all them other wrestlers. Got the silly looking hair. He real big in the arms, big in the chest. Got lots of them scars from getting hit in the head. He's just like all the rest. Except that he's got a whole lot of guts. A whole lot of guts. And I want to make one thing clear to you. I know about Carlos Colon. I know about Carlos Colon in New York, Tokyo, and all around the world. I know about him. And he beat a lot of good wrestlers. A lot of good wrestlers. But he ain't beaten me. And he ain't gonna beat me. I promise.
Yeah, this is the hard way. You know, for example, I can run all your equipment in that studio. I used to produce the world-class TV show. I booked the talent in there and produced the show. Sat in on all the post-editing. I can run all your equipment there. If somebody pulls a mobile up there to shoot matches out of arena, like the NWF, they film a lot of places we wrestle. Well, I don't go on to last, so what do I do for 3 hours? I don't sit in the dressing room, I go out and sit in the truck. I listen to camera calls, you know, I know how to produce. That's something that I would dare say, I don't know if I could name 3 other guys in professional wrestling that are actively wrestling. I'm not talking about those that have gone on to administration. I'm talking about those that are actively wrestling. I couldn't name 3 other guys that know how to produce, you know, and edit and put together a show. In
1988, Brody spent most of his wrestling time in Japan, wrestling for All Japan Pro Wrestling, winning the NWA International Heavyweight Championship on the second night of the AJPW Champion Carnival 1988 by beating Jumbo Tsuruta. Jumbo would then reclaim that very same championship from Brody on the 20th Champion Carnival 1988 show. Brody would wrestle 4 more shows for AJPW before going back home to Texas. On the 13th of July 1988, Brody was in Puerto Rico for some shows with the World Wrestling Council. On that night, he wrestled arguably his greatest ever enemy from the squared circle, Abdullah the Butcher, to a double disqualification. By today's standards, they wouldn't really be considered a wrestling match, but for what they were at the time, Brody and Butcher matches were legendary. Again, this is due in part to the fact that there was actually very little wrestling involved in their matches. Instead, their matches actually resembled something more akin to a bloodbath more than anything else. I mean, you just have to look at photos of the pair. I mean, Brody's forehead is totally scarred up from blading, as is the top of Butcher's head. They do not look like presentable things, to be honest. Blading, which is by and large outlawed across most professional wrestling outfits today, was the process of taking a move or a shot from a foreign object, hiding from view for a second while you pulled out a small hidden blade, and then you would then proceed to make a cut on your forehead and the blood would just start flowing. In Bryan Danielson's book, Yes, My Improbable Journey to the Main Event of WrestleMania, Danielson claims that if you stick and twist rather than push and slice with the blade, it actually prevents major scarring, which is probably something that most professional wrestlers would have liked to have known before now, but there you go. It's also an amazing book, you should definitely read it. In fact, listen to it on audiobook because Daniel Bryan, or Bryan Danielson himself, actually narrates it. But clearly, this was something that people like Brody didn't care about. Scarily, Abdullah would actually just use a fork to bust open his opponents, so they didn't really have a say, he would just use the fork on their forehead usually. On the 15th, so just 2 days after his double disqualification finish with Butcher, Butcher would team up with Dan Spivey. Spivey? I'm gonna say Spivey. And the pair would defeat the team of Bruiser Brody and Carlos Colon, with Colon being one of the founders and owners of World Wrestling Council. The World Wrestling Council was, by all accounts and stories from various wrestlers over the years, a horrific place to work. Not only would the crowds bay and beg for blood and violence, but often the matches would just be incredulously brutal to cater to those fans. It genuinely seemed like nothing was off limits. Even fire was used in these matches, and not like in the controlled inferno matches that WWE has held in the modern era. Far from that. It would just be like clumps of flammable substances wrapped around ropes at various spots and just set ablaze with no control over them whatsoever. Fans would often throw rocks, cups filled with urine, and sometimes even cups filled with glass shards straight into the ring. Not gonna lie, you'd have to offer me a lot of money to work there. So Carlos Colon was the boss, but he did have a right-hand man. And that man was Jose Huertas Gonzalez, better known to the crowd of Puerto Rico at the time as Invader #1. Gonzalez was working matches for WWC while also working as its booker. He would oversee who wrestled who, It just so happened that Gonzalez was being groomed to be the next Puerto Rican star in America, with WWF sniffing around him at the time. So when Bruiser Brody came up against Invader 1 for the first time, it's well documented that Brody just beat the ever-loving shit out of Invader. It's been said over the years that Gonzalez was actually a lovely guy. If he liked you, Brody was kind of the same in this regard. And unfortunately, Brody was not someone that Gonzalez was particularly fond of. You see, Brody even said in the past that Brody only cared about the career and the image of one wrestler in particular, Bruiser Brody. So Gonzalez being set up to be the next big star was of absolutely no importance to Brody. Brody was just looking out for Brody and his family. Well, after beating the masked wrestler to a bloody pulp, Brody may have sealed his fate for the future. You see, Brody was kind of part of a dying breed of professional wrestlers. He looked out for himself and he wasn't going to let anybody tell him what to do. And it seemed he liked to go out to the ring with no plan and just call all of his matches on the fly while in the ring. And God forbid you try to plan anything in the match beforehand with him. And yes, we all get that wrestling is a scripted event. We watch it on TV just like any other TV show or movie where we're eagerly awaiting to see where the writing team is taking everything that's going to happen next. But Brody didn't really operate like this. Infamously, Brody once worked a young Lex Luger in a cage match in Florida. Luger approached Brody before the match and tried to work out a match with Brody, just some basic bare bones stuff just to make sure they all had some direction. But Brody didn't like that one bit, and partway through the match, he just stopped. He stopped selling, he stopped attacking, he just stopped everything. Luger was completely perplexed, as was the referee. Brody would then start roughing Luger up a bit, to which Luger had the referee disqualify him, but then they couldn't get the door to the cage open, so Luger climbed out of the cage as quickly as he could. Brody was proud, maybe even a little bit too proud at times, for his own good, and he didn't really think of the fans in attendance. He was kind of just thinking about himself. You can actually watch that entire match on YouTube. I'll put it in the description down below if you're interested, but it's just a very bizarre thing. He just literally just stops. It's very odd. Behind the scenes even further, Brody had made so much money in Japan that he was looking to invest in a wrestling organization, and allegedly he had set his sights on Puerto Rico. Gorilla Monsoon, a legendary wrestling commentator and booker, owned a minority share in the World Wrestling Council, and Brody was looking to buy up his stake. So let me just paint just a quick little picture for you. You've got Bruiser Brody and Jose Gonzalez, who do not like each other. Gonzalez, who books all of the shows for WWC, could soon be answering to Brody. And Brody was someone who, his ideas were not particularly liked in those parts. They would happily accept his money though. In an even sadder portion of the story, Gonzalez had just lost his daughter at a very young age in an accident which saw the infant drown, something which just had to be weighing heavily on Gonzalez's shoulders. The Brody and Gonzalez situation was on a collision course with a ton of dynamite, and the explosion would rip through the wrestling world as a result. On the 17th of July 1988, Brody and fellow wrestler Dutch Mantell were sitting on the front steps of their hotel waiting for their ride to the venue. The person that was supposed to be picking them up was Jose Gonzalez, but Gonzalez no-showed. A different wrestler, Tony Atlas, offered the two a ride to the venue since he was on the card too. It was puzzling though. Why would the booker of the show leave his main eventer out and high and dry? Regardless of what happened, Brody got to the arena, and when everybody entered the locker room, something just seemed off. There was a strange air of tension in the room. Gonzalez was sitting in the room in a little group with Carlos Colon and Victor Jovica, another with a stake in WWC. And it was noted by people in the room that it didn't even look like the trio were talking. They were just kind of sitting there. Gonzalez would leave the locker room shortly after, and he would completely blank Brody. Dutch Mantell, who had arrived with Brody, remember, had been ignored as well, and sat in the locker room for a very short amount of time before he also left. Dutch couldn't take it. There was so much tension in the locker room that he just needed to move around and hope that the feeling of unease would subside. Dutch would make his way to the dugout area of the arena and just watch the people file in. He could tell that the place was going to be a sellout that night. He was gone for maybe 5 or 6 minutes before he returned to the locker room. Before Dutch returned, Gonzalez had already went back into the locker room and he ushered Brody towards him, asking if the two could talk. It was noted that Gonzalez had a towel covering one of his hands. Brody approached Gonzalez and the two made their way into the showers of the locker room. The next thing you know, all hell was breaking loose. Brody stumbled out of the showers, doubled over, and when others looked over to see what the commotion was about, they saw Brody bent at the waist with Gonzalez wielding a knife. Tony Atlas, the guy who had brought Brody to the arena, grabbed Brody and dragged him away from Gonzalez. As he did this, Carlos Colon shot past him and restrained Gonzalez, attempting to calm the man down. Brody was laid out on the floor of the locker room with blood going everywhere from his torso, and he was just pleading for someone to not let Gonzalez hurt him anymore. Dutch Mantell was walking back into the locker room and he hears everything that's going on, which was when someone tells him that Invader stabbed Brody. Dutch, as he walks in, then sees Brody sprawled out on the floor, facing the ceiling, talking with Carlos Colon. Colon asks Brody if there's anything he could do for him, to which Brody replies that he wants Colon to take care of his family and to tell his wife that he loved her. Allegedly, Brody echoed these words to many of the wrestlers who were present in the locker room that day. During this entire fiasco, Gonzalez was still in the shower area, and he was in there with Victor Jovica, and the pair were just arguing. And not long after, Gonzalez simply exited the shower area, walked around Brody's feet, picked up his bag and keys, and just left. Now remember, as Dutch Mantell was watching all of the fans file into the stadium, he could tell this was going to be a sellout. As a result, there was a lot of heavy traffic around the stadium, and it would take paramedics over an hour to get to Brody before he was taken to a hospital. Tony Atlas was by his side the entire way, and at one point, Atlas had to use his incredible muscles to help lift Brody onto the gurney and then into the ambulance due to the sheer size of his wounded friend. And Brody, the entire time, was clutching a photo of his son in his hand the entire way. Upon arriving at the hospital, there were hardly any doctors in the place that spoke English, and when Atlas eventually found one that did, he just sort of waved the situation off, claiming a stab wound in Puerto Rico was just like a cold in the USA. The doctor, he turned to leave, but Atlas was having none of it, and instead he grabbed the doctor and manhandled him over to his friend that was currently bleeding out. The doctor finally started working on Brody after this gigantic man decided to threaten him, and he had to pry the hands of Brody away from his wound because he was clutching at it the entire time. And he took a look, and as he did, Atlas removed Brody's shoes, only to find that Brody's feet had gone blue. This sent the doctor into red alert, and he called people over from every which way to try and save this giant man's life. Back at the arena, the police had arrived while Brody was in the hospital, and according to reports from various wrestlers in attendance, they couldn't have given less of a shit. In fact, the police didn't even think it was real, thinking that this was some sort of wrestling angle or storyline or something. Back at the hospital, the doctor who had been working on Brody exited the operating theatre and spoke with Atlas again. He told him that Brody had suffered from 2 stab wounds, one to the abdomen and one to the chest. The former of the 2 actually slicing up Brody's intestines, something which the doctors were able to fix. However, there was something much worse. Brody's liver had also been cut. Things were serious, but Brody was in a stable condition at the time. The doctor told Atlas that the best thing he could do was to leave because Atlas was a huge, hulking man and everybody at the hospital was scared of him. So Atlas did the only thing he could think to do, and he went back to the arena. Upon re-entering the locker room, Atlas was met with a sound that he did not want to hear. He was met with the sound of laughter, something which he found simply horrifying. People were laughing and congratulating each other on their matches because, despite everything, the show went on ahead as planned. But before Atlas had arrived, Gonzalez had returned too, and he had changed his shirt and was operating as if it was business as usual, as if what he had done had just not happened, and it was nothing more than a fever dream. Atlas was just incensed by this scene, and he literally threw a fit by throwing a chair across the room. A cop attempted to calm Atlas down, and he asked him if he'd seen anything. Atlas replied that he indeed had seen what had happened, to which the cop asked him if he'd managed to get a look at the wrestling fan who had stabbed Brody out in the hallway. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, fan? Hallway? Well, that's not what happened. Well, you would be right, because everybody that wasn't Tony Atlas or Dutch Mantell told the cops that some crazed wrestling fan had run backstage, stabbed Brody out in the hallway. Brody had stumbled back into the locker room clutching at his wounds, and the fan had just ran off. Tony Atlas hit a whole new level of anger at this, declaring this to be nothing more than a horrific lie. When asked who had stabbed him, Atlas pointed directly at Gonzalez. But Gonzalez was just acting as if it was still business as usual. Tony Atlas, ever the professional that he was, he would actually wrestle the match he was scheduled to be in that night against the Iron Sheik. During the match, the two would manage to converse, and Sheik also thought that Brody had been stabbed by a fan. But when Atlas corrected him, Sheik just rolled out of the ring and went to the back. Furious. The match hadn't even lasted more than a few minutes. Savio Vega then approached Atlas and told him to leave, handing Atlas his bag. Since Atlas had been blabbing to the police, certain individuals were now looking for him. Atlas left immediately, and he just went and walked the beach for the rest of the night. He didn't know what else to do. Dutch Mantell didn't walk around all night. Instead, he went back to the hotel, and he went to reception and asked for all of Brody's room calls to be redirected to his room. There, he would have a phone call with Brody's wife, Barbara. Dutch just thought, look, you better come down here, because something's happened to Brody, and it'll be best if you're by his side. Dutch would then go back to the lobby, and he asked the receptionist to call the hospital that Brody was in to see how he was. And after speaking over the phone in Spanish for a little bit, the receptionist began to cry. Bruiser Brody passed away on the 17th of July 1988 at 4:30 a.m. at the age of just 42 years old. After Brody's passing, all of the wrestlers involved were asked to make witness statements to the police. Atlas's account was so different from everybody else's that the police informed him that he would be summoned for a court date to testify as to what happened. While Dutch had seen nothing, remember he was back in the dugout watching the crowd enter the arena, the policeman taking his statement told Dutch to tell Carlos Colon that they ran the island, not him. And this was such a strange thing to say, because, did the police think Colon was part of this? Did Colon have a history with law enforcement on the island? Regardless, many of the talent started to come to terms with the fact that they were in an unfamiliar territory and someone, one of their friends, had just been murdered. So it was time to leave. But remember what Dutch had said? He told Brody's wife Barbara to come to the island, which was exactly what she did, along with Brody's only son, Jeffrey. After arriving at the airport, she was just sort of looking around, trying to find a familiar face to see if there was anybody there to pick her up with her son. And as she was looking around, she sees Abdullah the Butcher. And she approached him, and she asked how her husband was doing. And Abdullah looked at her just incredulously, and he couldn't believe that she hadn't been told yet. And Abdullah was the one that had to inform her that her beloved husband was now gone. Barbara, after identifying Brody's body, made the decision to have Brody cremated in Puerto Rico and then take his ashes home, which, in hindsight is probably a better decision than having a 6'8", 300-pound monster of a man escorted back to the US. A simple ceremony was carried out on the island with Barbara, Jeffrey, and a few wrestlers there to pay their respects to their fallen husband, father, and brother, with little Jeffrey even picking out his father's casket. A few days later, Invader number 1, Jose Gonzalez, was arrested on suspicion of murder. He didn't even spend a single minute in a jail cell though, because his bail was almost posted immediately. In 1989, everyone would witness on television Jose Gonzalez leaving a courthouse after being acquitted of murder. The jury had ruled in his favour, claiming self-defence. All of the locals who were told that they would be summoned to testify, testified. All of the wrestlers not local to the island either never received a summons, despite people like Tony Atlas being told that they would receive one, or received theirs after the trial had already ended. Gonzalez never even had to testify. The trial was an absolute sham. Dutch Mantel believes that the people of Puerto Rico at the time believed that professional wrestling was 100% real. Therefore, they believed that Bruiser Brody was this crazy psychopath who wanted nothing more than to hurt people. Therefore, the jury returning a verdict of Gonzalez acting in self-defense was probably something jury members would have found hard to be swayed from. There was also the fact that the murder weapon, the knife that had been used to stab Brody, was never and has never been recovered. In response to the loss of Brody, the wrestling world was in mourning. All Japan Pro Wrestling had a tribute show in his honour. Over 17,000 people were in attendance, all chanting Brody's name in a heartbreaking show of mass respect. Barbara and Jeffrey had been invited to the show and were present in the ring for the 10-bell salute in memory of Brody. And you know, who knows what the professional wrestling landscape would look like had Brody not perished on that fateful day in 1988. Brody was the epitome of larger than life. His character work alone would have been something that, going into the 90s, would have fit perfectly into the explosions in popularity of promotions, which were the WWF, WCW, and ECW. Not to mention all of the Japanese companies that were popping up out of nowhere like Noah and New Japan. While he would have been nearing the age of 50, that's kind of the beauty of professional wrestling. You can keep going, you can keep working, you can work around injuries, you can switch up your style so that you're not working as hard, you can have your character fit in more with the limitations of your shoot self. It's simply incredible that the man who took the life of this scary yet lovable man was simply able to just walk around free as a bird with no consequences for his actions. And as someone who has at least had a few training matches and trained in professional wrestling, I know the basics, I know character work, I know the ins and outs, I know the names of nearly every move. I was a commentator for a little while. On behalf of everybody in the professional wrestling industry, I just want to say thank you, Frank. Your portrayal of Bruiser Brody paved the way for so many wrestlers that inspired all of us today. Without Brody, there's no Mick Foley. And without Mick Foley, well, wrestling just wouldn't be wrestling without them. And that was the tragic, tragic story of the murder of Bruiser Brody. Whew, that one was emotional. I don't know why that one got to me so much. I think it's just because of it being a murder in the professional wrestling industry. Things hit different when it's something closer to you. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please keep liking and subscribing and commenting, because it genuinely feels amazing to wake up to all those notifications, because it's just, yeah, this is becoming a thing that I need to do. Like, I need to go to work, I need to eat, I need to drink water, I need to go to the gym, I need to record videos. So thank you. I'm also in the process of making a Discord. Check the description for a link to that, because if the Discord has been made by the time this video is live, it'll be in there. If not, then yeah, I'm still working on it right now. I want to have like a little hub that everybody can come together for all things true crime, and even not true crime, off-topic things as well. But in the meantime, thank you very much for watching, guys, and don't forget, the shadows have the best stories, even if they're fucking heartbreaking.